Hello, my name is Lisa Didier. I'm the local programme manager for Leicester City. And today we're looking at food waste. And as it says underneath, we're looking at the interconnectedness of climate change and health. And food waste is part of that, is part of climate change. So, food is not rubbish. And that's something that's important to get across to children as well. That eventually, if food goes in the bin, it ends up on a landfill tip like this, full of food, which isn't good. And we'll come to talk a little bit more about that later. And another sort of fact is that an area that is larger than China is used to grow food that's never eaten. And that's obviously worldwide stat. And that's just a lot of food that's just gone to waste and is never eaten. That's massive. And that's a yearly fact as well. So half of all of our food waste is avoidable. Now, we're going to look at that. What do we mean by avoidable? And there's three different parts to that. So the first part is things that are unavoidable, food waste that is unavoidable. And that is things like orange skins or bones. That's unavoidable. It's like a byproduct. There's possibly avoidable, the next category, and that's things like potato skins, if you don't eat them, or bread crusts, which some people don't eat. The next category is what we're talking about here, is avoidable, and that's all half of this food waste is avoidable. And that is things that we are intending to eat, but actually don't eat in the end. And so half of the food waste comes into that category. So who wastes the most food? Is it food companies or is it us? If you just have a little think about that for a minute or two, which one could it be? Answers on a postcard. But it's actually us. So when you talk about this, people think that it's big companies or, supermarkets or big companies that produce food. And that's what often people have in mind. But in actual fact, it's us. And that's a lot of waste as well. And when we look at the total worth of food waste, that's a lot of money. Now, bearing in mind, 13 billion is just been wasted. The government's proposal for the new Green Deal is 12 billion a year. So you can imagine the contrast in that. And often when we look at the next stat, of course, about the carbon footprint of food waste is equivalent to 87% of all global road transport. The 12 billion that's going to go to the Green Deal, a lot of it is around transport and the announcement around moving from diesel cars to electric cars. But still, if we looked at just food and the transportation of food, we could, focus, we could really get a better carbon footprint if we're looking at the road transport as well in regards to food. And then in relation to the photo, the picture that was on earlier, what happens when food waste goes to landfill is that there's no oxygen that gets further down where it's all been sort of piled on top. So it does produce methane, which then escapes into the atmosphere, which obviously doesn't help as well, environmentally friendly. So then, why does it matter? I think in the previous slides, we know why it matters. because reducing food waste reduces carbon emissions in all sorts of areas. So how are we going to do that? Well, if we look at this as the carbon footprint and as energy, and we look at the food that ends up on your plate or not, as the case may be when we're talking about food waste, you've got all those processes that it goes through. So you've got from growing to transporting to some sort of place that sorts the food, or directly to the market, and then you've got your preparing food, and then unfortunately you've got waste that goes to landfill that makes methane. So it's farm to fork is what we want. We don't want farm to fork to landfill and all those processes in between, because that gives us a sort of negative cycle when it's going from the ground straight back into the ground with landfill and then back into the air with methane. So who's doing what? What's the action? What's happening? Well, food waste is recognised as a global issue, and it is in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. However, the UK government only has guidance, and when something's guidance, it does mean it's voluntary. It's if you want to follow that. What we have locally is the Leicester City's Climate Change Action Plan. And under this action plan, which, as it says at the top, goes to March 2023, there are a couple of objectives around food waste. So raising public awareness of the climate impact of your choices. And I think that's an important point, because people think climate change and they think about things that happen in the oceans and things that, the Arctic, things that are happening there, and global warming. And you feel like sometimes they're really big, which are big issues, but maybe too big for you to do something about. Whereas in actual fact, you can do something about your food, and these things are, raising awareness about the impact of buying food is quite tangible. It's something you can see on your plate. It's something that you can see in regards to food waste that's going into the bin. We've also got the food plan, which is looking at, local growing and increasing that awareness of where food comes from, which is important for children to realise that process of how food's grown as well. And then the work with local school caterers. And what's in the plan for the local school caterers is to looking at, they already have quite a lot of locally sourced ingredients in our school meals, but we are looking for more locally sourced ingredients. Introducing less meat, which we'll talk about later, but we've had meat-free Monday, this Monday and the previous Monday that they've supported. So less egg choices as well, and less dairy and dairy-free choices, increasing dairy-free choices as well, but also bearing in mind that that's in consultation with pupils and parents as well. So reducing the carbon emissions from food miles is something that we've talked about in reducing that, looking at the food transport as well and how important that is. I just want to add in here as well about food banks and food poverty. Food poverty is something that's increased during this time. So there has been a rise in food banks. And also when you think about, when I read this statement about how medieval welfare and food used to work, it just had a resonance with what's happening today. So in the medieval England, if you couldn't eat, well, even in medieval Europe, in fact, if you couldn't eat, you went and asked the monastery for food. And it feels sort of really going back in time with food poverty as well, about asking for food. Then you've got the issue about perfectly edible food. Now, there is a project in Leicester called Perfectly Edible that they have food given to them from supermarkets, and they cook with them and produce great food with food that's maybe just, you know, being given away because of the date, which is another issue on food packaging, and but it's still perfectly edible. And I think the other thing in connection with that is that you've got people who maybe don't know how to cook as well with what they've got. So, you know, the reliance on things that are already made is not a sustainable diet as well, but it does affect sort of with it ties in with climate change as well, about not being able to cook with food. So locally we have a Cook and Eat project. That Cook and Eat project is looking at linking schools with food banks. And so if anybody wants to know anything more about that, then please contact me about that. But we're not just connecting schools with food banks, we're looking at recipes and things that families can easily follow. Because also when you're talking about that, it ties in with fuel poverty. So it's about having easy recipes and things that can easily be made in one pot and not using, you know, lots of energy to cook food. And tying in with that, with the rise in food banks, food poverty, there's a rise in free school meals. And I want to bring that up now because really when you're looking at school food, there has been a rise in free school meals recently, but we want to get the free school meals right. And these are the reasons why. So a free school meal may be the only meal a child may eat that day. And a lot of teachers will tell you that. A lot of cooks know this because they know the families, they know the school. And there's also a sort of a Monday phenomenon where children are really hungry at lunchtime on a Monday. And that's because they haven't really eaten very much over the weekend. So the free school meal is important to get right because it's the only balanced meal a child may eat that day. And the other thing about that is balanced meal. We also talking about, you know, that the rise in takeaways as well. So, and it's not just about having no food, it's about eating the wrong food at home. But at least you know with the free school meal, it's a balanced meal. And it follows the Eat Well guide. Now, in order for to have the Eat Well guide at home and follow the Eat Well guide, it's 20%, 6%, sorry, of households would need to spend a quarter of their disposable income. And that's quite a lot to get that Eat Well guide, you know, in place when you're looking at your own menus at home. So if you add into that food poverty, then the free school meal, which does follow the Eat Well Play guidance, is really important for children's nutrition. And we know 1 in 4 people skip meals to save costs, and that's mainly the adults. Often there's a statistic around adults skipping their meals in order for the children to eat as well. You know, and you've got, however, low quality diets, which I mentioned with takeaways, with high sugar and high fat content, which a lot of takeaways are, actually cost more monetary per calorie as well. So there's a lot of interesting debate about that. So when we look at universal infant free school meals and free school meals, so I will include them together in this slide. You should be looking at 90% really within a school about the uptake. However, some schools in Leicester have 59 to 73% uptake, which then, well, what are they eating? And really more nutritionally suspiciously packed lunches, which are, again, not encompassing the Eat Well guide. And also, we've seen, as teachers, you'll have seen those lunch boxes with 2 donuts in, cold chips, cold chicken nuggets, and not very much nutritionally in them at all. And also with packed lunches, we've got food waste. And not only food waste, but packaging waste. And why, I'm also mentioning about the uptake of universal infant free school meals, because the Department of Education report showed that if there's an increase in uptake of school meals, there's a decrease in the number of packed lunches, which is less food waste, which is less food packaging. But also, just aside to that, there's also an improvement in attainment. You can't focus and you can't learn if you've had just 2 donuts or half a packet of biscuits, which is often you find in your afternoon lessons. So there is an improvement in attainment for increasing school meals in general. However, what was interesting, there wasn't any change if the increase in school meals in the body mass index. But that's another issue we can deal with another day. So just looking at packed lunches as well. So if you've got high processed food in packed lunches, again, this is not what you often find. It's not a sustainable diet. There's an increase in packaging, waste packaging, if they're not in washable containers. And when I say sustainable diet, what do I mean? And that means reducing your carbon footprint as well by having a sustainable diet. So in general, it's reducing red meat and having weekly meat-free days, eating more plant-based foods, moderating those higher fat dairy foods, and reducing food waste. And that all adds up to that sustainable diet. So food waste is part of having a sustainable diet. It also increases planetary health as well. So sustainable diet uses less, it's low carbon as well. And you get a reduced food waste. It equals a healthier diet and increased planetary health. So what's the ideal? We want to increase initiatives around food waste, especially with schools. We want to improve that school meal uptake to get those away from packed lunches around food waste and packaging waste. We want to increase food growing in school, so children get to know where food comes from, but also it's nutritionally better and there's low food miles by having something, even if it's just salad, that's grown in school, that's then made at the school lunchtimes, or children cooking with them in school as well, with anything that's grown, which is mentioned here. So, we want food grown in cooking lessons to be used in cooking lessons and to be served at lunchtimes. And looking at linking a nutrition action group with the eco group to look at food waste as well, in particular. And also linking food growing with STEM. But also food waste as well lends itself to many other, for looking at maths, looking at English, presenting. In with maths, you've got looking at food waste in the dining hall, which we'll come to, and weighing that. So what do we say? We want to improve those lunch times with this nutrition action group in school. And we want to have pupil voice in improving those lunch times. So if you've improved the lunch times, and if you've improved the food that ends up on the plate and the food that's served, there's going to be less waste at lunchtime as well. And you're going to see an increase in those end school meal uptake. And this is photographed from Overdale Juniors, where they invite parents in regularly to eat, or they did for COVID. And hopefully at some point in the future, we will get back to that. And that creates a better atmosphere in the dining hall when you've got adults eating with children as well. So as a school, you're asking yourself, what can we do? What's the first steps to dealing with all these issues in school? So measure the food being wasted, and there are grants available. The best way to measure the food is within bags. And you use those scales you get for luggage, so luggage scales, so you can pick things up with them, and there's grants available for that. So just get in touch with me if you want anything around improving, reducing food waste. We can have a look at that. And then set an aim to reduce the amount of food waste using a baseline, and we'll talk about what Avenue Primary did when they used the baseline, what happened. We've mentioned about School Nutrition Action Group. You really want to look at what days are the most waste is being produced and what's not being eaten, and feeding back to your caterers about that, because you can influence that. People don't think they can, but they can, because the cook doesn't want to be cooking things that are just going to end up straight in the bin. And it's a waste of everybody's time. So they are quite open to looking at that. How can we improve the menu and just reduce the food waste as well? And you only have to ask midday supervisors who are in the dining room. They know which days, which food is going in the bin. And they also, in the kitchen, know how many bags they have. And so they can relate that back to looking at the menu. And like I said, liaise with the school caterers as well and look at alternatives, or ask them to look at alternatives as well. Having less meat on the menu, which a lot of are doing with the meat-free Mondays. And initiatives in school to improve the uptake of fruit and veg in school. So there's 2 points around this I want to just talk about. So one is about, especially in the key stage 1, where you've got little children, and sometimes the fruit that's on offer it can be an apple or can be an orange, and things that sometimes the fruit can be as big as a small child's head. Now, that's not really, they're not going to attempt that if you're faced with this massive piece of fruit. And also what you have to appreciate in your sort of years, well, age 7 and 8 and different ages, but around that age, you get the problems with the teeth and wobbly teeth or no front teeth. And sometimes things like that, fruit and veg, are quite hard to get through. So it's a way of looking at things like chopping them up smaller, putting them into small bowls, and you will definitely see an uptake of fruit and veg. And this is something that Sandfield Primary School did, and they bought some coloured bowls, brightly coloured, chopped up the fruit and veg, sort of carrot sticks and things, celery, put them all in as the children were going through at the towards the end of where they were served the food, and children would pick them up, and they found a massive increase in the uptake, and it was just to do with presentation. Now, 5 a day, obviously that initiative is helping to look at the uptake of fruit. Presentation is just one thing, but one of the stats around 5 a day from an adult perspective as well is that only 30% of adults have 5 a day, and 8% of teenagers. So if we're getting those good habits in early at primary school, one hopes that carries through into being an adult, but also, especially teenagers. So creating that habit early on is vitally important. And, have initiatives to encourage children to eat what's on their plate. So we've talked about, we want to increase the numbers for school meals, but it's not just about increasing the numbers, because we've got the increase in the numbers, the children come up to the serving hatch, they've got their food. It's actually then what happens to it on the plate. So it's like, great, we've increased the free school meals. Now, are they actually eating it? That's the point. So there's different ways to encourage children to eat what's on the plate. And normally, asking your school nutrition action group, they're the best ones to think about ideas. One of the things that's commonly used is stickers for finishing what's on the plate. And I do training with midday supervisors, and one of the things that I explain to them is that for children to try a new food, and it's the same for adults as well, but when you're in the school environment, they've got to try a particular food half a teaspoon, in fact, about 15 to 20 times before the child is used to eating that. And some food in school that's served might be familiar to you and I, but it might not be familiar to lots of children. So lots of children, for example, from different cultures, but not only that, children who aren't used to having cooked food or having vegetables, eating vegetables from a young age. And that's something that, you know, we really want for you to have a look at, because it could be individual to each school. And these initiatives are really good to help children eat. And for example, going back to if a child doesn't like sweet corn, half a teaspoon is actually about 3 little corns, isn't it? 3 little bits. And so from a midday perspective point of view, they've got to be encouraged every time a child has 3 little ones of those, half a teaspoon, they've got to be congratulated on having that. And then after 15 times, 20 times of encouragement, they will eat it. But you've got to have a lot of patience for that as well. And then composting. So when we look at things that are unavoidable, again, looking at the food waste, so there's unavoidable, there's possibly avoidable. The possibly avoidable and unavoidable, a lot of that can go into the compost. Cooked food is different, and there's a different way of composting, but you can find lots out about composting. You can ask me, and you can ask your eco team as well, who know all about composting. But that's one way of stopping food going to landfill as well. So, you know, another one of food waste facts, that out of England's domestic food, 13% of schools 13% of waste is from schools. That has increased during COVID, and the way that food has been served in schools in those little recyclable packaging during these sessions, it has increased food waste and packaging waste. Now, one of the things that I've learned recently is that if you've got a pizza box, because it's cardboard, even if it's stained or if it's greasy inside, that can't be recycled. And the same goes for your the recyclable packaging that you're having in school at the moment. So we really need to look sort of long term at, you know, getting children to have food on plates, reducing that food waste, trying eventually to get back to eating correctly. Some schools are in the dining hall and off plates, so that we're reducing the amount, and 13% is still quite a lot. And then we go to the case study. So Sue Pears from Avenue Primary is camera shy, didn't want to present, so I've got a case study from them. They've done really, really well, but they have been working on reducing waste since 2017. And again, we are looking long term with this. There are particular things you can do next week, around, especially around collecting compost, but some things have to have a little plan. So in 2018 to 19, it was 1.5 bin bags, food waste. They've actually got that down in the previous academic year to 3/4 of a bin bag. And I mean, that's brilliant. I think that's really, really good, but they're determined to even get that down further. So how have they done that? And it's a little bit of a long slide here, but still, they actually worked in, as we mentioned, the Food Working Party and the Eco Committee joined together. On that group, they've got the head teacher and some staff, midday supervisor representation, manager, and they have kitchen staff, and everyone discusses that. And the children are really in charge of those meetings as well. So they carry out regular food waste surveys using tally charts linked to today's menu, and that's where that could be incorporated into lesson time. around, you know, the maths lessons, charts especially. And it's a real life scenarios that they're dealing with. It brings maths to life more. They do feedback on which dishes are popular and which are creating food waste. And the results are analysed. And again, that's questionnaire, that's to do with maths. And they're fed back to caterers in the whole school. And when presenting things in assemblies as well, that's a really good skill for the children. They vote, a whole school vote on the menus. And they also vote, on what their theme days are. When they have parents in, they have different themes, and their food is cooked appropriately, specifically for when parents are in, and the children will cook food that's served at lunchtime as well. They have regular tasting sessions, have a lunchbox audit as well. And that's important. Again, like we've mentioned, it's not just about the food waste that's coming from the school meal, it's also what's been wasted from the lunch boxes. Portion sizes were looked at as well. And in the different schools that I visit, and this is often a topic of conversation, where portion sizes, you know, you can't have the same portion size for a 6-year-old as you can for some, you know, especially some of the boys in year 6, they're more taller than me. But parents, you know, having paid their money, need to know that they're getting value for money. So sometimes portion sizes are too big, or sometimes they're not enough. And it's a way of meeting the needs of the school, the pupils in school as well. So that can be discussed with the caterers. And like we've said, they've made suggestions for the presentation of food, of which I give you one example with fruit and veg. And what was interesting is also pupils did look to where the food waste goes to and what happens to it, and how some of it is actually composted locally in Leicester. And that's a really nice project for some of the pupils to look at about food waste. So for your students, you know, you can look up having a school nutrition action group. You can and ask, you know, asking the teachers for help. They can arrange a food waste audit themselves with the teachers' help. But I think for teachers, what we want to look at is your school food policy, and remind your school governors they have a legal duty that all children eat well in school, so they should be backing you up. And I think if any time you want to change something in the dining room or with food in school, it's important to have an updated school food policy. That's something I can help you with as well. And I did mention the lunchtime supervisor training, so when we get to the really normal, not new normal, old normal, then that's something I can help with, and the lunchbox audit as well through the Leicestershire Nutrition Dietetic Service. And I know a lot of schools have had this done, and it's important to have the re-audit done to look at that as well. So I've rambled on about that as well. Are there any questions from people there? Should I take this? Oh, hello.
Yeah, if you stop sharing, then we'll be able to see everyone's faces.
Okay. Oh, let me do that.
I was wondering,
Yeah.
what are the biggest what makes a kid a picky eater? Is what I've been wondering.
Oh, you see, yeah, that's a good question as well. Have I stopped? Yeah, sharing. Yeah. I think often it's what they're not used to, but again, it's quite a complicated psychology as well behind that. But we were going to have an initiative starting in Leicester City schools called Taste Education. And I'm hoping, again, when we get to the next normal, that will happen again. And they have a particular philosophy around using the 5 senses with food. So they have lots of new foods, lots of different foods, and they don't actually they don't actually ask them to taste the food. So it's about going through a process over a number of weeks, just looking at the food, describing the food, fits very nicely in with English, but also touching the food, not essentially tasting it, and then listening to the food. What noise can we make with food? And then obviously you've got smelling the food. And only at the end, or if children want to taste things during those initial sessions, they can do, but not until the very end. And it's their choice to taste food. So it's quite a different way of looking at food, and playing with food is important as well. And often when one of the projects we looked at with Sandfield Post Primary, with the Grandma's Project, children couldn't use the knives and forks, and that's when we got the grandmas to go in and help them with knives and forks and help them with eating. But often in that process, in particular homes, children haven't had the opportunity to play with food, and that is part of that child development at that, under 4, that gets them used to food. So often you've got to bring that playing with food element back for the very younger ones. And the taste ed is really, really interesting, and something that I would like to start when we're able to, and start training with that. And that is one way, but it's a really good way of dealing with fussy eaters and picky eaters. But sometimes parents often say that they're really surprised when they come in and eat with the children, because they sit in school next to them eating the veg, and the parents say, well, they don't eat anything they don't eat that when they're with me at home. And sometimes there can be a positive peer pressure in a school towards eating the meal that as a child, you can really wind your parent up if you just go, I'm writing that, I don't like that, my own children do that. They know nothing winds me up as much as to going, what have you made us now? Like, I'm always trying new things, much to their annoyance, and it's they act as though I'm poisoning them, by giving them a new food. And obviously they're older than the little small children that you get, but it's that at home children can be just really awkward with their own parents, and what often happens is with picky eaters and children who sometimes only want to eat particular food as well, it does change as they get older. So again, sometimes there's more of a positive peer influence as they get to teenagers, and they start widening their food options purely because their friends are eating that food. And it opens them out to different sort of cultural food as well. If they get different friends and they'll eat at their house, and they might serve different food than they have at home, but they're willing to give it a try. So it's quite interesting that that sort of picky food and the reasons why. It's a good question.
I think I picked up any interesting habits from my parents. So
yeah, yes, and often when we talk about cooking skills as well, that's one of the things that obviously cooking's on the curriculum, but often you learn cooking at home. And in families where, modern day families, when if grandma's not around or your family's not around, often you don't learn things. If parents are working both at full time, it's quite difficult to come home and work, cook something from scratch. Some people will do, and some people enjoy cooking and let the children cook with them. But if you're busy, sometimes it's really, really difficult. And that's where often can be grandmas or an older person who has more time, who's can be patient as well to teach children things. I know I learned, things from maybe baking and things from, from other people. So it doesn't have to be just parents that you learn from as well. So that's why it's really important having those, cooking sessions at school, because if a child, going back to your picky eaters, if a child has cooked something, they're more likely to eat it. So if they're cooked with a new food, they're more, and there's lots of evidence that goes to show this. And then even better, if you've grown something, you're more likely to eat it just raw. And then if you've grown something and then you've cooked something, that's like, you double whammy. The child's invested, haven't the time in that, and so they're just because of that time investment, they're more likely to eat as well.
I did have another question as well.
Good.
So I've been doing my homework. So say you're trying to implement a scheme in school, but you're having a bit of struggle getting maybe senior leadership team on board. What would you find would be a bigger motivator? Would it be saving money or saving carbon?
Well, I think a little bit of both really as well. And also it's pupil voice. So people often say to me, when we talk about trying to change the menu, and they think that teachers think that it can't be changed, or they're told that it can't be changed. But if you've got pupil voice, that's really powerful. The children are saying, you can't ignore that. However, if we go back to food waste and trying to change the menu as well, it could be argued that there are fussy and picky eaters and they're not eating, the potatoes because they're cooked in a particular way that they're not used to. So there could be a sort of bit of an argument in that sense. However, when you look at the bin bag situation and all the work that Avenue have done towards that, I mean, going from 1.5 bin bags to 3/4 of a bin bag by changing the menu, that's had a real impact on the waste that's going out to school. And that's just by, again, pupil voice. And I always say facts like that you can't argue against. You can't argue against a bin bag because it's there. It's a fact. And I think, it's trying to influence those senior leadership teams in school and the head teacher that food is important at lunchtime. And some of the time that's ignored.